The discovery of vast deposits of natural gas in the Mediterranean Sea has set the stage for a standoff between neighboring countries and one that could potentially change the geopolitical landscape of a region rich in resources. Just last week, Israel, Greek-administered Cyprus and Greece, they signed a deal to build the longest undersea pipeline in the world. At a cost of about $7 billion, the nearly 2,000-kilometre line is going to carry upwards of 12 billion cubic metres of natural gas every year. It's going to go from Israel's offshore fields underneath the Greek island of Crete and then on to Italy. From there, it will be distributed throughout Europe, ultimately supplying about 10% of the continent's needs. Turkey opposes the pipeline, with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan saying there can be no project in the EastMed that excludes Turkey. Well, let's go to occupied East Jerusalem and speak to Gabriel Mitchell, a policy fellow at the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, Mitvim. His research focuses on energy security and the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. Gabriel, thank you so much for your time. Now, does it seem obvious that this EastMed pipeline is a way for Europe and the EU to bypass their dependency on Russian gas? At the moment, I believe the EU as a whole, which is not all of Europe, but most of Europe, gets about 40% of its gas from Russia.
Yeah, I think that the name of the game today in the global energy market is diversification of supply. So the European Union, like all international actors, large and small, is trying to diversify the number of sources in which it's procuring its fossil fuels, but also diversifying the type of energy from fossil fuel sources to also alternative energy and green energy. So there's certainly a political interest on the part of the European Union to diversify away from dependency on Russia. It's looking into projects both in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in North Africa, and of course, importing U.S. LNG. So this is a piece of an overall policy of diversification of supply.
What about the commercial viability of this EastMed pipeline? What's it looking like at the moment?
So the commercial viability is challenging. At present, the European Commission is looking into the commercial feasibility of the EastMed pipeline, which, as you mentioned, would cost an estimated $7 billion, and of course is going over an undersea space that lies along an existing fault line and has its own technical challenges. But at the very least, in the context of the politics, the political boxes more or less have been checked off. You had Greece, Cyprus, and Israel all present together last week. Italy was noticeably absent, but the assumption is that in theory, if there's commercial feasibility, then all of these parties would be interested in cooperating together. The main question is, if there is enough gas in the Eastern Mediterranean to be placed in a pipeline, and that pipeline is constructed, would that natural gas be competitive on the European market by the time it reached, say, Italy or elsewhere in the European Union? And on that, a lot of experts are split. A lot of it is going to depend on global energy prices, in particular global gas prices, which continue to drop. As long as energy prices stay down, an expensive project like the EastMed pipeline is probably going to be tabled for the time being, but that doesn't mean that the commercial interests aren't there. It doesn't mean that the political interest isn't there. It just means that this project may not necessarily be realized in the immediate future. It might have to take a couple of years for the global energy landscape to change.
Yeah, I'd read that Russia's Gazprom has already said that it would be prepared to lower its prices even further, presumably therefore making Russian gas even more competitive. Gabriel, what about the role of Washington in this? There are two other pipelines, and just about 24 hours ago from the time of recording, Turk Stream was opened to supply Russian gas through Turkey to southern Europe. And then there's Nord Stream 2, which is Russian gas going through a pipeline and mainly going to Germany. And the Americans have already said they're going to sanction any company that builds any pipeline for Nord Stream 2. They're going to sanction any company that builds additional pipelines that connect with Turk Stream. But they're certainly not going to, presumably, sanction the EastMed pipeline because they're allies with Israel. So what about the American connection to Europe's gas needs here?
Yeah, as you mentioned, if the Russian goal is to develop as many pipelines as possible to Europe, that certainly runs counter to American interests. Although, of course, the United States' understanding of the European position, there's a necessity to acquire as much energy as is possible, and it's difficult to compete with the Russian price point. The United States is supportive of the Eastern Med pipeline. The Prime Minister of Greece was in Washington today, and it seemed like that was a very productive set of meetings. At the same time, the United States hasn't backed the EastMed pipeline in any kind of commercial way. You don't see American energy companies investing in this project. So it's a little early to tell, but there is a competition going on about who's going to be supplying energy to Europe, and the United States is very much interested in supplying LNG to the European Union. If diversification of supply is the name of the game, then exporters have as many opportunities as they'd like to try to diversify the number of export options. And so we're seeing an increase in these kinds of massive projects, but at the same time, as the energy market becomes more diffuse, as prices drop, it also increases the degree of competition that exists in the market and the number of available suppliers. So the Russian intention is to try to retain not only European dependency on Russian gas, but also to ensure that there will be consumers in the coming decades. And certainly the general push in the global market is to both diversify that supply and the number of sources.
Perfect timing, Gabriel. Thank you so much indeed. That's Gabriel Mitchell on the Newsmakers, and that's it from us for another edition. See you next time. Thanks for watching.